Christopher Columbus is often celebrated as a brave explorer, a maritime hero, and the man who discovered the New World. But behind this glorified image lies a much darker and horrifying reality. History, when unfolded, reveals that beneath his great fame there is a tale of greed, cruelty, and devastation so horrifying that it shakes the soul. When Columbus first crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean and set foot on the islands of the Caribbean on October 12, 1492, it was a moment that many schoolbooks describe as the dawn of a new era. But for the innocent inhabitants of those islands, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would span centuries and claim millions of lives. The native people, known as the Taínos, Lucayans, and Arawaks, had been living in peace and harmony for over 1,000 years. They were sophisticated people with complex agricultural systems, advanced astronomical knowledge, and rich cultural traditions. They had developed sustainable farming techniques, created beautiful art, and built thriving communities across the Caribbean islands. Their lives were organized around community cooperation, spiritual connection to nature, and respect for all living beings. When Columbus and his men arrived, the Taínos welcomed them with fruits, fresh water, and smiles. They thought these strangers were guests who needed help, perhaps visitors from distant lands seeking friendship and trade. The natives offered gifts of gold ornaments, not understanding that this generosity would seal their doom. But Columbus saw their kindness as weakness, and their generosity as an invitation to exploitation. His eyes glittered not with friendship, but with an insatiable greed for gold. In his own diary preserved in the archives of the Indies in Seville, Columbus wrote that the natives were so simple and unarmed that with only 50 men we could enslave them all and make them do whatever we want. These chilling words, written in his own hand, show that Columbus's intentions were never about discovery, cultural exchange, or human progress. They were about exploitation, domination, and the ruthless pursuit of wealth at any cost. At first, the Taínos thought these strangers had come to share knowledge, to build relationships, or perhaps to establish peaceful trade routes. The reality, however, revealed itself with terrifying swiftness. Columbus began demanding impossible amounts of gold and precious materials from people who lived simple lives focused on agriculture and fishing. Those who had nothing to give, which was most of the population, were subjected to brutal punishments that defied human decency. Men were forced into backbreaking labor in makeshift mines, working 18-hour days without adequate food or rest. Women were torn from their families to serve as domestic slaves or worse. Even children as young as 9 or 10 were forced into bondage, their childhood stolen forever. Anyone who dared to resist faced unspeakable horrors that haunt historical records to this day. Some were publicly whipped until their flesh hung in ribbons. Others had their hands severed if they failed to meet impossible gold quotas. Pregnant women were not spared. Many were forced to work until they collapsed, losing their unborn children. Whole villages were burned to the ground, not out of military necessity, but simply to terrorize other communities into submission. But the cruelty did not stop with physical violence. Columbus implemented what can only be described as a systematic campaign of genocide. He imposed impossible tributes on the natives. Every adult over 14 had to deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. Those who lived away from mining areas had to provide 25 pounds of cotton instead. The penalty for failing to meet these quotas was mutilation, specifically the cutting off of hands, which were then hung around the victim's neck as a warning to others. Historical records show that thousands suffered this fate, creating a population of maimed and traumatized survivors who served as living reminders of European brutality. Columbus also established the encomienda system, which was slavery disguised as labor management. Under this system, Spanish colonists were granted control over groups of indigenous people, supposedly to civilize and Christianize them. In reality, it was a license to work people to death while claiming moral justification. Women and children suffered particular horrors under Columbus's rule. Young girls, some as young as 9 or 10 years old, were taken from their families and sold into sexual slavery. Columbus himself wrote to a friend about this practice, describing it as if discussing livestock. 100 castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm, and it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. Thousands of indigenous people were shipped to Europe to be sold in slave markets. Many died during the brutal Atlantic crossing, packed into ship holds with no sanitation, inadequate food, and diseased conditions. Those who survived the journey were paraded through European cities as exotic curiosities before being sold to the highest bidder. The Europeans brought with them diseases that proved even more deadly than their weapons. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza, unknown to the native populations, spread like wildfire through communities with no natural immunity. Entire families died within days of each other. Village after village was wiped out completely. Historical estimates suggest that disease killed between 90 to 95% of the indigenous population within the first century after Columbus's arrival. This wasn't accidental. There is evidence that Europeans sometimes deliberately spread disease by giving infected blankets to native communities. Starvation followed closely behind disease. As people were forced from their agricultural lands and into mining operations, food production collapsed. Traditional hunting and fishing grounds were seized by colonists. The complex agricultural systems that had sustained millions for centuries were destroyed in just a few decades. Columbus and his men destroyed not only bodies but also souls and cultures. The Taínos' rich oral traditions, their sophisticated understanding of astronomy and agriculture, their beautiful artwork, and their complex spiritual beliefs were all systematically erased. Spanish priests, claiming to act in the name of Christianity, destroyed thousands of indigenous books, artworks, and religious objects. They forced mass conversions at sword point, replacing ancient spiritual practices with European religious concepts that had no connection to indigenous worldviews. Children were separated from their parents and forced to forget their native languages. Traditional dances, songs, and ceremonies were banned under penalty of death. Within a single generation, cultural knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years was lost forever. Yet in Europe, Columbus was hailed as a hero and visionary. He was rewarded by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, praised by merchants who saw new opportunities for profit, and even justified by church officials who claimed his actions served God's will by bringing Christianity to the heathen. The Catholic Church issued papal bulls that legally justified the enslavement and murder of indigenous peoples, claiming that non-Christians had no rights that Christians were bound to respect. This religious sanction gave Columbus and other colonizers moral cover for their crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, the wealth stolen from the Americas, gold, silver, and other resources extracted through forced labor, flowed into European coffers, funding the Renaissance and the rise of European global power. The magnificent art, architecture, and cultural achievements of Renaissance Europe were literally built on indigenous blood and suffering. Historians now estimate that the pre-Columbian population of the Americas was between 50 to 100 million people. Within 150 years of Columbus's first voyage, this number had collapsed to fewer than 5 million. This represents one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history, a death toll that dwarfs many recognized genocides. The island of Hispaniola alone, which Columbus claimed as his personal domain, had an estimated population of 1 to 3 million Taínos in 1492. By 1548, fewer than 500 remained. An entire people with their own language, culture, and way of life had been virtually eliminated. Similar devastation occurred throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and eventually across both North and South America. The conquistadors who followed Columbus learned from his methods and applied them on an even larger scale. The impact of Columbus's actions extended far beyond his lifetime. He established patterns of European colonialism that would dominate global politics for the next 500 years. The wealth extracted from the Americas through forced labor funded European expansion worldwide, while indigenous populations on every continent faced similar devastation. The racist ideologies used to justify the enslavement and murder of indigenous Americans became the foundation for later systems of oppression, including the African slave trade and European imperialism in Africa and Asia. The notion that Europeans had the right to claim and exploit any land inhabited by non-Christians became a cornerstone of colonial law. Even today, many Latin American countries struggle with the social, economic, and cultural consequences of this initial devastation. Indigenous communities that survived face ongoing discrimination, poverty, and cultural suppression that can be traced directly back to the systems Columbus established. In recent decades, historians and indigenous activists have worked to reveal the true story of Columbus and early European colonization. Countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. UNESCO has recognized the devastating impact of European colonization on indigenous cultures worldwide. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal the sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations, from the advanced engineering of the Incas to the astronomical knowledge of the Maya. These discoveries make the cultural destruction initiated by Columbus appear even more tragic and senseless. Yet Columbus statues still stand in cities around the world, and many school curricula continue to present a sanitized version of his story. The myth of Columbus as a brave explorer persists because it serves powerful interests who prefer not to examine the violent foundations of European wealth and power. Today, when we see holidays named after Columbus or monuments raised in his honor, we must remember that these celebrations honor a man who initiated one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. These statues stand on the graves of countless innocent people who suffered and died because of his greed and ambition. Columbus did not discover a new world. He destroyed civilizations that had existed for millennia. He did not bring civilization to the Americas. He brought slavery, genocide, and cultural destruction. He did not serve God or humanity. He served only his own lust for wealth and power. The true heroes of this story are the indigenous peoples who resisted, who preserved what they could of their cultures, and who continue to fight for justice and recognition today. Their courage in the face of unimaginable brutality deserves our admiration and respect. History is not what the victors write in their books. It is hidden in the blood and tears of the oppressed, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to seek the truth. Only by facing this dark history honestly can we hope to build a more just and humane future for all peoples. The legacy of Christopher Columbus serves as a stark reminder that heroic narratives often hide horrific realities, and that the price of willful ignorance is measured in human lives and suffering. We owe it to the memory of those who died and to the survivors who still carry their stories to tell the complete truth about this painful chapter in human history.